All right. So most of you have probably, I think from our list here, most of you have actually been to this webinar before. So the Your Yard in the Sunshine State. This is the February edition. We've been off for a little while. We had the holidays happen, and January was really pretty fast. Oh, let's see. Yeah, Fran, I have started. So let's see. Can the rest of you hear me? Fran doesn't seem like you can hear me. So
I can hear you.
you can? Okay, Marcia, you can hear me. Fran, it might be maybe volume on your end, maybe, because I don't have you muted. So let me know if you can hear me yet. I see you in the chat, but oh, I'm going to chat back to you in case you can't hear me. That's not very helpful, is it? All right, I'm going to get, oh, Jessica's coming. All right, we've got a few more folks coming in. There we go. Yeah, hopefully, Fran, if you can get your volume maybe up. Thanks for being patient, guys. Yeah, it's like a two-man, usually it's a two-man team with Zoom because it's hard to manage all this. But for those of you who have been here before, I know we've taken the last couple months off. So we're back in the February action of what should be going on during this month and sort of some things that come across my desk. Let me get, there we go. And then Marcia, you keep your ears and eyes. If my slides don't look quite right, just let me know. But for those of you who have been here or maybe are new to this type of webinar, this is a little different than maybe just a webinar that talks about one topic. We'll go over some things that should be happening in February, some of the things that are flowering, maybe some edible vegetable gardening tips or species that should be in season right now. And then we kind of get into just some recent things that have come across my desk in the last month or so. And then of course, I'll follow up with some of the resources and a survey for you guys to help me deliver information to you in a better way or more information that you need. So we'll follow up with some of those IFAS resources that I'll mention while we're talking during the webinar. But feel free, I think most of you are, I think you all are muted for now, to keep down on the background noise. But if there are questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and see if I can clarify anything for you or if you have questions. So I'll try to keep an eye too on the chat box. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but hopefully I can and keep us rolling here. But a lot of you, I think all of you probably who are on the webinar today are familiar with the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And that's really where a lot of our urban horticulture education programming falls into. It falls in these 9 principles that are research-based that we teach a lot of to our residents here in St. Lucie County, but throughout the state. This is a very applicable way to have a sustainable, functional, and beautiful landscape. And so that's based on these 9 principles that we teach. But today, most of the time when we do these webinars, we mainly focus on a couple of these principles, mostly being right plant, right place, because usually when you have those elements in place, there's a better chance for success for pest control, for disease control. And then we kind of touch a little bit into how to manage some of these things that maybe come up in our landscapes and how to manage them responsibly by first identifying really what's going on before we really start to attack things with maybe that chemical approach first. Maybe that's not really what's recommended or needed, perhaps. So we'll touch on these couple principles as we go along through our slides here. But what I like to show you first, and you all are probably familiar with these infographics from IFAS, is what should be happening during this month. So these are really beautiful infographics that are created about what's flowering right now. It's not an exhaustive list. we all are probably seeing things in our landscape or, at our office or when we're driving down the road, we may see things that are flowering that aren't on this list. But I have seen some of the bougainvillea right now really start to show a little bit. But we start to get into some of the more warmer season things as our temperatures start to warm up a little bit. We've come out of some of those cooler temperatures. And so things are starting to wake up a little bit for our early spring season. So these are just some nice infographics every month that I like to show. Right now, we're really cranking as far as vegetable growing. This should be, sort of peak season for some of our vegetable crops like peppers, eggplants, tomato especially, but you'll see here, and if you're familiar with these infographics, I love them. It's not that I don't love North Florida, but we're not there. St. Lucie County straddles Central and South Florida, and so these two lists here are a really nice guide for us to know what we can still actually put out in our vegetable garden before it gets too hot. So we'll it's actually a pretty big list that we have. Some of our beans are still able to be planted right now, but most of these things, really, that Central and South Florida list, you'll see a lot of similarities there, but some of our warmer season crops, they can still be put in there before our temperatures get too warm. February is a really nice month for vegetable gardening, so I always like to show these infographics. And so I follow up with you guys. We do have your email address from your registration, and I'll be able to send you some of these links that are provided to us from University of Florida. So I'll share this one definitely with you guys. Let me get through this slide. The next one I want to show you, there we go, is a newer slide from Fresh from Florida. And you may be familiar with that department of, it's actually the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Sciences. This is, I've shown this slide before, on a monthly basis, what's in season, but they've actually redone their website a little bit. And so their infographics right now are really cool. So this is actually not only just vegetables, which I thought was kind of cool. You can actually select for certain things that are in season right now if you're looking for seafood or vegetables. But I decided to include everything. So you'll see that production in Florida right now is really high. Overall, we are really high in our vegetable season crops, even some of our cooler season and warm season crops. Obviously, not all of these things are grown here typically in St. Lucie County, but the reason I like to show this is that you might see these when you're at the grocery store, if you're at Publix or Walmart. When you see that Fresh from Florida label, which you'll see, oops, didn't mean to move my slide here, which you'll see on that upper corner, that label is actually guarantees that product has been produced and packaged in Florida. And so I always like to show this in case you are interested in local produce or locally grown or harvested food systems. I thought this was kind of a cool new infographic from them that shows some really nice pictures of what we're in season with in Florida. So we kind of make everybody jealous, right, of all these other colder temperatures everywhere else. We're really in the height of our growing season. But when I think about February and what has happened in the last several weeks, actually, is some weather. We have had some pretty cool temperatures, towards the end of January, beginning of February. This is a slide that I like to show you guys because this is something that you all can access. This is the Florida Automated Weather Network. They nickname it FAWN, but this is something that they produce weekly reports, and a lot of agricultural growers use this on a weekly basis. There's a lot of data they can glean from this, but I also think it's helpful for homeowners because you can kind of see and look back. Gosh, have we had a lot of rain? Have we had some of these colder temperatures or something that maybe has changed and is affecting some of our landscaping? And those cold temperatures that we had have definitely affected us, right? You'll see my little arrow that's pointing. That's St. Lucie County. So the Southeast district kind of goes all the way, us all the way pretty much down to the Keys. It cuts them off a little bit, but all the way down to, very much the South Florida end of things. But at that top, really where the arrow is pointed, is St. Lucie County. And you'll see we've had some pretty low temperatures in the 30s, and also some pretty warm temperatures. So we've had sort of a little bit of an extreme, which isn't necessarily uncommon for this, this time of year. We just haven't recently in the past, the recent past, or our recent memories, we haven't had that cold of a temperature in the last several winters. And so we have, we're starting to see some of that chill or cold injury, perhaps, that have affected some of our plants in the landscape. So that's why I thought, sometimes when we do these webinars, the weather hasn't changed much, or maybe it's just rained a little bit more. But this one, this particular webinar, I wanted to specifically address the cold temperatures and show you a few things that I have noticed, and you all have probably noticed in your landscapes or your neighborhoods or wherever you are looking out. I have seen some cold injury or some chill injury. We have some pretty tropical ornamentals in our landscapes typically, and they got dinged a little bit. Our cold temperatures didn't stay for very long during the night, but they did dip down there. And so we have seen a little bit of chill injury, particularly on some of our palm species. And I wanted to show you this fact sheet. Many of you Master Gardener volunteers out there know about these EDIS documents, but these are fact sheets from University of Florida that researchers and extension agents write. And this one is a great one. So if you are interested in sort of, I know we're not really dealing with cold temperatures right now, so it feels like, why are we even talking about this? But we have seen some damage on some of our palms and other ornamental landscape plants, perhaps some of our vegetable crops if you have some. But this is a great document on cold damage on palms because they are really tropical and subtropical, and the fact that we have a lot of them in our landscapes. This picture I actually took from, let me see if somebody else is joining us. I heard a little ding. No, doesn't look like it. Okay, but the reddish blotches that you see, this is actually a coconut palm, and I've seen this personally on my coconut palms, where you see some mild chilling injury, where you see some of these red to yellowish blotches. This is something that, and in this fact sheet, they also address it, that sometimes we're really, after a cold snap or a cold event, sometimes we get a little bit anxious to start trimming things because they don't look very good. And we are really starting to see that the last little while as the trees and shrubs and palms start to show us some of that chill injury. It's really best to leave as much material as possible because we typically right now, we're coming to the end of February. We probably aren't going to have any more of those chilling temperatures or chill hours, but typically we suggest not really trimming a whole lot, because those materials that especially are around palms can be insulators. There's still food and nutrients in those palm fronds, and they can actually also help to insulate that tree or that palm in case we get any more cold temperatures. Like I said, we probably aren't going to get any. The further we get into March, we probably won't dip down into the 30s anymore, but we might be seeing some of this cold injury. I've actually noticed too as well, and you might have seen it, where if you see some things that they are on their own, they're not really surrounded by other plants, they typically suffered a little bit more than ones that were in a kind of a thicker landscape, or they have more plants around them, where there's actually, there's some heat generated and some shielding going on from those chill injuries, where you'll see this slide here. Oops, didn't mean to go that far. This slide here is actually one of the baby mango trees that we have at the extension office that is sort of out on its own in the field a little bit east of the extension office, the physical office. And so Anything closely to, closer to the office or surrounded by other trees didn't look quite as bad after. This is actually a picture of my car with some frost on it. And I actually live much further east, closer to the river. But there were a couple nights that there were actually frost on my windshield. The next morning. And so you'll see here, this little baby mango tree will most likely, we're keeping an eye on them. It will most likely recover, but you'll see sort of this yellowing, almost, sort of burned look to the leaves, especially the ones closer to the top that are sort of out in the air. We're going to keep a close eye on these, but as we start getting these warmer temperatures, new buds should be pushing out and new leaves should be pushing out of that small tree. It isn't to say that we might lose some of those leaves. They might actually drop off, and this little tree might not look good for a while. But that's that mechanism of that plant protecting itself, and probably going to lose those burned or kind of crisp leaves due to that chill injury. So I don't know if y'all have seen any of that in your landscapes, or maybe kind of on the edges of landscapes, where the cold air came in. On the edges of leaves, you might see some browning. The reason I mention this as well is that as we get into warmer temperatures, we forget maybe what has happened. And so we might be, getting in some calls from homeowners to the Master Gardener Help Desk or to myself that say, hey, this doesn't look good. I think my plants are diseased. We need to kind of think back and say, well, how long has this, really looked like this? Did you notice this after some of those cold temperatures? Because in fact, it might not actually be diseased. It might actually be some of that cold injury showing up. So those are some of the questions that we typically go through as we're trying to diagnose what's going on with some of our landscape issues. So now, we kind of get into the part of the webinar that I typically kind of go through my emails in the last little while, or maybe there's some from the help desk that from our Master Gardener Help Desk that they've sent me that I thought maybe would be interesting, or perhaps something that you all are seeing as well, and just sort of clarifying maybe what's going on. This was a yucca plant from a resident that emailed me pretty concerned. This is a really old one. If you see the size of it here on one of the far, I guess that would be the left side of your screen, the far side of that. It's a pretty old yucca plant. Looks pretty good, from the top of it. It's pretty green. You may see some of these yellowing leaves on the bottom, which I'm not too concerned about. She was concerned, this resident happened to be pretty concerned about some of the lichen that was growing on the bottom of the trunk. We deal with these questions a lot, where this is not harmful to the tree or the shrub or this yucca plant. This is something that is completely natural and not a pathogen. This is an interaction between actually a fungi and a algae that is naturally occurring. So this is really not something to be concerned about. This oftentimes comes with age of landscape plants or shrubs. She was also concerned about some of these spots on the leaves of the yucca plant. And with our cooler kind of wet temperatures, you remember we had some of those like more humid mornings and evenings with those cooler temperatures. A lot of leaf spot fungal organisms love those conditions. And there's lots of, when people say there's a leaf spot, there's lots of different organisms that can cause leaf spots. And so I've got a couple of examples here today. Many times leaf spots are strictly aesthetic. It's really not something that warrants a fungicide or control. There are some leaf spots that do. There are some organisms that can really be detrimental to the plants, but yucca is really one of those. This is a typical ring leaf spot that is not really causing harm necessarily to that plant. It is, there's some that maybe don't look very good. So some of the recommendation that I might tell this resident is, she could cut off some of these fronds if they get particularly spotty, but paying attention to the upper canopy and the new growth being healthy, it's really not something that warrants chemical control or really much control at all. The next slide I want to show you is a gentleman brought in a staghorn fern sample to me that was really quite beautiful under the microscope. This particular leaf spot is caused by an organism called Rhizoctonia, and it is a fungal organism that can affect many different plant species. Oftentimes it's dealt with in the vegetable crop or commercial agriculture realm. There aren't too many species in the landscape that can be affected by Rhizoctonia, but staghorn fern actually is. And it was one that I didn't really know that. When you look up staghorn fern on a IFAS fact sheet, you'll read that most of the time there's not really any pests or diseases that bother it, except for Rhizoctonia, which I didn't know. So I took this sample, looked under the microscope. Sure enough, there were beautiful spores just everywhere on these leaves. And this particular organism can actually kill staghorn ferns, which I didn't really know this. So there are fungicides, typically copper fungicides, that are used to help control this outbreak of Rhizoctonia on this gentleman's staghorn fern. He noticed that it was sort of spreading, which is pretty typical of fungal organisms when we have very high humidity or cool temperatures and some high temperatures, which we often have here. We can't do anything about rain, right? But we can do things about overhead irrigation. So I advised him, to sort of turn any irrigation heads that were touching any of these, turn that water so it's not splashing these spores everywhere. The other recommendation was to take some of the older affected fronds and actually remove them from the landscape. Take that material and throw it away into a garbage bag, not put it in your compost. Don't put it near the staghorn ferns, and sort of removing that inoculum over time, and in combination of using a fungicide labeled for ornamentals and staghorn ferns, he's able to control this. So I thought this was a kind of a new one that has not been brought to me before. But like I said, not everything, not every leaf spot really warrants particular control at all. Sometimes it's just purely aesthetic. Whereas this one with the staghorn fern and this particular organism, this Rhizoctonia, actually does warrant control because it can really spread amongst those staghorn ferns and really cause some damage. It actually gets into the bud and can be fatal to them. So that was a new one that came across my desk. The next couple slides I want to go over are about ornamental scale insects. And so some of you may have some experience with these pests that crop up in our landscapes sometimes. This was one that was brought to me by a master gardener, actually, who had a neighbor that was really struggling with some, what she didn't know what was going on. But it turns out what she has are some soft scale, some croton soft scale on her crotons, which are very common insects on crotons, particularly when there isn't a whole lot of good air circulation. These particular plants happen to be on a porch with no, they were pretty crowded, which scale insects love that scenario. There are no natural predators in there to help take care of them. And what was going on was that this particular resident was using, you'll see on the opposite side, this particular insect control product. And so she had been using this product 3 or 4 times and really just wasn't having any success controlling these scale insects. And so what you'll see here on the picture of the croton, and what I was really looking for was the stem picture. She really wanted to show me what was happening on the leaves. And what you're seeing here is sooty mold. And many of you are very familiar with sooty mold. That is a kind of a naturally occurring mold that will land on leaves and branches if there are piercing sucking insects that are dropping honeydew. That's their excrement. So their poo is landing on the leaves and the branches, and you might see sooty mold. Well, oftentimes people get worried that the sooty mold is the problem. That's not the problem. It's the insect that's causing their excrement to be that honeydew. That's what's really the problem. We need to control the insect is how we control the sooty mold. But with this product that she was using, the reason I mention it is that it's not labeled for soft scale. And that's why it's not really working. And so that recommendation of using a certain chemical really needs to be labeled for the insect or disease that you have. And that's really what I want to get at, is knowing what you have before you start trying to treat it, because there can be certain treatments that just won't work because they're either not labeled for that or it's not a recommended practice. And so one of the things on this next slide I'm going to show you are a couple of different types of scale. And we have a lot of different species of scale here in Florida. We have soft scale and hard scale. That's kind of how we break them up into groups. Well, soft scales are the only ones that will, of the scale insects. Hard scales don't produce honeydew. So they are not going to be the ones that are on the crotons causing that honeydew. Those are croton soft scales, and you'll see those on kind of on the bottom of your screen here. But my point with the control of scale is that even if you're using a neem product or a horticultural soap or a synthetic insecticide, what's tough about controlling scale is that you need to get them really at the crawler stage. And you'll see my little arrow here, where with this Florida wax scale, you'll see different life cycles of the scale insect. And what happens with crawler stages is they're the ones who are actually moving around. If you've ever seen scale on a plant, you think they just look like bumps. They're not really moving. After they become adults, the females really, they park it. They lay eggs, but they're the ones that are not going to really be moving. So that crawler stage is really kind of the nymph stage of the type of scale here. That's what really can help be controlled, because they don't have that waxy covering on them yet. Any sort of horticultural soap or neem oil, if it really warrants that, if you have enough of them and you need to really control them by that without just pruning off some of the branches and removing them, if you have a really big outbreak, you really want to make sure you're catching it in the crawler stage, because that's really where you can control them with some of those products. There's a little trick sometimes to figure out if you have, what stage are my scale, what are they in? You can use a piece of double-sided tape and actually put that around some of the branches, and those crawler stages will actually get stuck in the tape. And that's when you can tell, well, this is a good time to actually use some of those products that are labeled for scale. If not, you really may be dealing with something that really warrants more of a mechanical control, if you can actually rub them off. The other part that is tough with diagnosing scale is sometimes they will be on the plant, but they will be dead. They will not be there anymore. And so really sometimes there is cycles, that we go through, and seasons where we might have this scale attack that's happening to some of our crotons. Are really susceptible. They're pretty tough, in the landscape, but they are susceptible to croton scale. But these are something to look out for in our spring seasons. And so scouting for these types of pests before you get one of these large outbreaks that you see kind of on the bottom of your screen can be a whole lot easier to control than when you have, just tons of them all over some of your ornamental plants in the landscape. So just a little note about scale, since we may start seeing them pop up here as we get a little bit warmer temperatures. There are a lot of natural predators that can help us control scale. And so sometimes when you see just a few, it may not warrant, major control, but when sometimes pruning things can actually help us to get rid of pests. But when you have some of those larger outbreaks, sometimes we need to go to other measures. So we'll move from there and talk a little bit about this avocado that was, these pictures were sent to me, and actually some leaf samples were sent to me as well from a homeowner. Oftentimes with diagnosis, you need the story, right? You all as master gardeners are familiar with that. You need a little background story to figure out, how long has this been happening? What is it really looking like? What are your practices? Sometimes that's what I need to ask somebody. And sometimes they're really, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but sometimes they're really obvious questions. Have you been watering this plant? And in this particular case, they have been watering a lot. This is a pretty small avocado tree. I don't remember the variety that was used here. But what has happened is that the resident came to me and said, it still wilts, even after rain, even after irrigation, something is going on where the leaves are wilting. I said, okay, let me see some pictures, maybe bring in some leaf samples. So what you're seeing here, this is what makes my little, if I had antenna or little hairs on the back of my neck kind of perk up a little bit, because what you're seeing here are leaves that are wilting and they're staying on the tree. Oftentimes when things wilt with either drought stress or even cold temperature stress, the plant's sort of natural reaction in general is to drop those leaves. Don't spend any more energy on them. I'm going to drop them to the ground. When you start to see things that are wilting and they stay on the branches or the tree or the shrub, typically my little antennas go up. Something's going on in the roots. So this particular avocado, you'll see here in that kind of close-up bottom picture, is you'll see some of these wilting leaves that are turning brown and sort of curling, but they're staying on you'll see some of the other ones on the ground. That's actually, the homeowner was actually putting leaves on the ground. So those are not ones that have really dropped. So sad story to this particular avocado is avocado root rot is a very common problem with avocado. This is a fungal root rot that can happen to really any avocado variety, that the roots are staying very wet, and that stress, we have certain organisms that live in the soil all the time, but this is a fungal organism that can be present, that is basically can attack roots that are stressed, that are sloughing off, that are really starved of oxygen because they're rotting. And so that particular, it's a Phytophthora root rot that can come in with an avocado. And really what happens is that root rot, the fungal organisms are plugging up the roots really. Those particular cells and kind of pathways through those root hairs are being plugged with fungal organisms where the plant can't take up any more water, even though this particular resident was giving it a lot of water, too much water, in fact. And so avocados, especially when they're young, we need to be very careful to not overwater. So sometimes we kill things or damage things in our landscape with love, right? We think, well, more fertilizer, more water, it has to be good. They like those things. Why wouldn't they want more? But sometimes that's really more of a detriment than it is a good thing. And so this particular avocado, some of the recommendation is to really pull some of that wet soil away from the roots and almost sort of give it a little bit of air. Try to actually air out those roots, even though that's, the roots obviously go much deeper than just the surface level. There are some systemic fungicides that are used in this particular scenario with avocado, but oftentimes they are not labeled for use in homeowner situation. So these might be restricted use pesticides, restricted use fungicides. So this might warrant someone, if he's able to get a hold of a pesticide or a landscape contractor who has a license for those pesticides. But this isn't typically something that you can go out to a big box store or garden store and get. So avocado root rot is something that we deal with here in Florida and where avocados are grown. So this is just another sort of indicator that, when you see something that is wilting and those leaves are staying on, even though there's plenty of water, my eyes go right to the roots. Something is going on underground, underneath that. Something in that root system, which in this case is avocado root rot. So with those small avocado trees, always, and really any tree species or plants in general, especially with our soils and some of our urban compaction, we can have some soils that seem sandy, but they can really hold a lot of water because they have a lot of compaction. So we need to make sure that we're not overwatering things, especially ones that are sensitive to root rot. let's see, let me get my next slide here. So we'll move on to the last few slides that I have, and then we can open it up for questions or things that you guys are seeing in the landscape. The last couple slides I have are about palms. The last little while I have seen some Ganoderma, which is a butt rot of palms. Ganoderma xanadum is the species of Ganoderma that affects only palms. We have several species of Ganoderma out there in the world that are shelf fungus that can affect other hardwoods, but xanadum is the species of Ganoderma that only affects palms, and this is a pretty devastating disease to palms, which can affect really the lower, typically it affects the lower lignin area of the trunk. And so what we see in this particular picture, this is kind of a series of pictures here of one particular area in one resident's yard, is this beautiful picture of this snowy egret, but you'll see at the bottom of the picture are some white conchs, and that's the basidiocarp. That's the growing stage where spores are produced in that Ganoderma butt rot. And so this is a tough and a bad situation for that palm. Queen palms, which you'll see here, they are quite susceptible to all palms in general are susceptible to Ganoderma, but queens especially. And you'll see here in the middle picture where the trunk has actually folded over on itself, where this particular palm, that entire trunk really is compromised by that fungal infection. I'll show you a couple other slides that are interesting as well, because Ganoderma is one of those diseases that there's really not conditions in our landscape that are good or bad that can cause Ganoderma. It sort of is one of those things that kind of comes in. It's naturally occurring in our soils. And many of you on the webinar today are very familiar with the recommendation of not replanting with palms in an area that has been diagnosed with Ganoderma. Conchs are not always present, and that's the tough part. We may see a palm just wilt, and there could be other situations going on, but one of the things that may be happening is Ganoderma. But we don't see those conchs every time that when a palm is infected with the Ganoderma. So that can be a tough way, that's where diagnostic tools can really be tough. But this particular situation, we did see the conchs, and so this is a for sure 100% Ganoderma situation going on here. But in this ornamental bed area, because spores, we can't see them with our eyes, they move by wind and water and the water column in the soil and can move through the soil. This is an area where it is not recommended, to replant that area with a palm, any species of palm, because you're really risking it, that it may become infected with Ganoderma. Hardwoods, other shrubs, absolutely. They are not susceptible to this species of Ganoderma. This particular next picture, the couple pictures came in kind of in different emails, but a same resident, but she was emailing me some pictures of the bottom of her trunk of these beautiful Canary Island date palms. And it threw me a little bit because that first picture on the top has really small white growth. And I thought, okay, I'm pretty sure, this is Ganoderma, because all of the other signals are lining up and all the other signs are lining up. These are very young conchs. They're very young. Oftentimes what we see in pictures or the fact sheets are these big, orange to white conchs. I rarely see them caught this early where they're this tiny. And then you'll see the bottom picture that sort of, it almost looks like an ooze, but if you were to touch it, it is hard. But that white basidiocarp or the conch is a sign of Ganoderma. And so with the last picture that she sent me was the palm on the left is the one that has this white growth. And I thought, yep, it looks different than the other one. And so you're even seeing the beginning of that wilting process of that Canary Island date palm, where that one on the other side, on the right side, looks good, right? Canary Island date palms are notorious for magnesium and manganese deficiencies, and you'll see that yellowing. That's pretty typical. That's not what we're looking for with Ganoderma. But the other one, you'll start to see that crown does look different. It's starting to wilt a little bit. The recommendation is, unfortunately, if you see those conchs, that palm needs to come out, because that lower trunk, the lignin in that trunk, is compromised, and that palm could actually fall because if it is rotten enough. So any sign of those conchs, that the recommendation is to actually remove that palm, unfortunately, especially when they're this big and old. But the other recommendation is to carefully watch other palms in your landscape. You know, if there's something that you're seeing with Ganoderma conchs, it is definitely recommended to keep watching, especially this other one that looks good now. So we call that conch patrol. Many of you are in communities that have landscape boards that there are people on conch patrol. This next slide I'm going to show you is our last slide of the Ganoderma, where we were not looking for Ganoderma. I was called to a PGA area just to kind of overlook some of their palms that had some questionable things going on. And there were many things going on. There were some nutrient deficiencies. There was some misunderstanding about what really a palm, you know, when it looks good versus it's just a nutrient deficiency versus lethal bronzing versus Ganoderma. And so what was interesting about this picture is I am kicking myself because I didn't have the top picture, because what we were doing in our little landscape walk, looking at all these other palms, the top of this particular palm looked great. It was one of the queen palms, and I don't know if you're familiar with some of them, but sometimes they look a little ratty when they get kind of old and they've been over pruned for years and years and years. This one actually had a really beautiful green canopy, not much nutrient deficiency. Some of the other palms around it had some chill injury that we talked about earlier in the webinar, but this one really looked pretty good. So I was blabbing about, you know, other palm. I really like to talk about palm trees and palm diseases. So I was blabbing about some other things. And unfortunately, I looked down, and if you can see, there are basidiocarps. There are conchs on the bottom of this palm. And so, and I'm not afraid to like get in somebody's landscape if they let me. And so I'm walking, you know, I'm looking around, and lo and behold, under these sort of dwarf the Schefflera, you know, popular landscape plants, are a bunch of conchs. And what was going on was it had, you know, this palm was affected, and eventually, you know, we might see it wilt. But what we were seeing, the signs of what we were seeing of Ganoderma was this conch and the two little ones, kind of the orange little ones on the bottom. Well, I turned around and also saw a previous palm had been taken out. They may not have known what was wrong with it. They took it out. They didn't grind the stump. So the stump was still there. It was kind of at the, what would that be, at the soil level. And what was going on was that palm was affected by Ganoderma. And even though it was gone and the stump was still there, conch started to sprout out of that. And so when we turned around, there was a very large conch kind of right at the soil surface, still attached, because there's still lignin in that palm that was sort of cut at the base of the, or right at the soil line. So unfortunately, right there at the recommendation point was, you know, this palm really needs to be removed because it is infected with Ganoderma. So it was a good site visit because we were able to sort of get some clarification about some chill injury that was affecting some palms that didn't look diseased versus ones that actually had something going on, whether nutrient deficiency or disease. But this one was kind of, it popped up out of nowhere. So that was not a great diagnosis for that homeowner, but at least we caught that pretty early. So just a little review about today, just in case you kind of think back on some of those slides that we talked about, because if you'll, I'll kind of quit sharing my screen here, and then I'll open it up to you guys to see if you guys have questions or things that you're seeing that I can clarify, but we're going to have our next webinar, same sort of format. I'm already starting to get things in my emails and from the help desk and site visits that I've been to in the last few days to put on our March webinar. So that towards the end of March 30th, we'll be advertising this as well. So we'll be able to send you the link, and I'll send it to you all as well. Since you're signed up here, I have your email. We don't share it with anybody else, but I will send you guys the link for the next one. But over the next little while, you can always feel free. Many of you on webinar know me. So if you have some emails or photos that you want to send to me, we can include for next week. Please feel free. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so we can talk about some things that maybe you guys have any questions or things that you guys have seen with some of the weather that we've had and a little bit of chill injury. We're going to see some things that got a little dinged in the landscape, and we need to give them some time. I think that's mostly what is, one of the recommendations, obviously, right after cold weather is, don't trim anything really hard. We still need to be a little bit patient as we come into our early spring temperatures and things like that before we get too crazy with the pruning shears to give some things some time to recover. But any questions? We got a few minutes to open it up. If you guys have any questions or things that you want me to maybe cover next time, I'll have my chat box open here too if you don't want to speak up, but I'll give you guys a second if you want to. I'm always open to, it's interesting when people see things in the landscape that maybe I haven't seen, or maybe we're seeing all the same thing. So
I can tell you a story about Ganoderma.
Yeah.
I had a grapefruit tree and it got Ganoderma.
Okay.
Which I understand is not real common, but
No.
it did. And I knew it was it, but I didn't take it out because
Okay.
I liked the tree.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It had lost all its leaves and most of its bark.
Really?
But I had Seminole squash growing up it.
Oh, really? Yeah. Use it as a trellis.
Yeah. And the birds liked it.
Yeah,
So,
Ganoderma is a weird one because we have those different species. It isn't common to see it, but grapefruit was it an older tree too?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was older.
Yeah.
So one day I was working in the yard. I was working in the front yard, but gone to my shed to get something. And I thought, this tree looks weird today. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
So I went on. I had something in it. I had something, an air plant in it.
Okay.
I thought it shifted or something.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came back in the backyard to put the stuff away, I looked at it again. Thought, boy, it really looks weird now. Well, it had fallen over.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It had no roots left.
That's a great example of, that's that butt rot. It's the
Yeah.
buttress. Someone actually, it was really cute in Master Gardener training this week. Someone asked, we had studied palms the previous week, for like 3 hours. And so this week someone asked, well, why do they call it a butt rot? And I said, that's a really good question, because we have bud rots, which is the top, and then we have butt rots. But buttress, like the buttress of a tree, where that kind of tree flare or the trunk flare is really the buttress of the tree. That typically, I think that's why they call it the butt rot, or it's the bottom also.
Yeah.
But that's typically where you start to see those actual, like the shelf, the fungus part of it.
Oh yeah, I had a lot of conchs.
Yeah, if you have a lot of conchs, but
it had been damaged in the hurricanes. It had
Okay.
blown out partly. And
Okay.
they tried to prop it back up.
Yeah.
And I put a lot of grass around it to cover the roots that were.
Right.
And when someone came in and cut my grass, they cut all that grass down and they also nicked all those roots.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that, I try to teach, you all as Master Gardener volunteers is, up in the canopy, all the way down the trunk, and then always consider the roots, like what's going on with the roots? Has something changed down there? Has there been a lot of water? It's not always the canopy or the top that shows us maybe what's happening. So yeah, it's always good to just look all the way around.
Yeah, they were gone.
Yeah. Those fungal organisms that can really destroy that lignin and that tissue are really good at it when they get a hold of it. And that's what can really cause that wilting, because there's really, the roots are the only thing that take up, nutrients and well,
Right.
water really. But yeah, that's oftentimes with that avocado root rot, when you start to see that wilting, even though there was plenty of water, too much water from that particular resident with the young avocado tree. But when you start to see that wilting and the leaves are still staying there, that's when my little hairs go up. Something's going
Yeah.
on with the roots. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anybody else have anything they were starting to see or questions happening in the landscape? We may start to see some insect pests that typically come around this type of year or this time of year with our spring kind of warmer temperatures. We may see some push of some scale insects or some of these other mealybugs, aphids, things like that start to come in when we get some of these spikes in temperature, which we're having the last couple of days have been pretty warm. The mornings are still nice, but yeah, it's getting a little bit warmer. So
I had another thing happen
yeah.
the day I was out in the yard. I have a lychee tree,
Okay.
and there was one little sprout of leaves on it that were curling.
Mm.
And I looked at them, and the back were rusty, like a bright orange rust on them.
Oh,
I
okay.
cut it off.
Yeah, if you see that again, Marcia, let's bring it into the extension
Okay,
office because there is a lychee mite.
I know.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that because that rusty sort of like, you can't really see anything really, I mean, unless you're
Yeah.
really looking at the microscope. I'm having a gentleman actually bring in a mahogany leaf sample, hopefully in the next day or so. Usually mahoganies don't have really pests or diseases that affect it too many. We don't have too many that are typical, but there is a mite apparently that can affect a mahogany, especially a stressed mahogany tree, which I'm just working with this resident right now to figure out what's going on. But his leaf picture sort of had this sort of rusty look to it. So I'm curious if it might not be the same type of mite, but there are different kind of mites that affect different tree or
Right.
plant species. But I'm curious if you can get it into me, at least that way I can see under the microscope. But yeah, if you see that again on, and mites, and typically some of these insects that we see really love new growth, which is what we're starting to see on some of our,
Yeah.
landscape, either ornamental or trees. A lot of those piercing, sucking mouth part type of insects, they go after the freshest. It's tender, like we all
Yeah.
love like fresh lettuce or microgreens because they're yummy. And insects like the same thing. They typically don't go after that mature, unless they're boring insects, things like that. But a lot of the softer bodied insects like that soft material, because you have to think about their mouth parts too. They're not very hard. We always say that they're like a straw, but a straw can be hard. An insect's, mouth part is really tiny. So that nice tender growth that happens about this time, we're going to probably start to see some of these other insects. So yeah, bring that in. I'd be curious. We could take some pictures.
I'll bring it in tomorrow.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll figure out maybe what's going on.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, Marcia.
You're welcome.
Well, I want to thank you guys. If there aren't any other questions, feel free to jump in and stop me. But if there aren't any other questions, I just want to thank you guys for coming. I hope you can come next week. I hope every month is a little bit different. Sometimes it's a repeat of diseases or things that you're seeing, maybe, last month or the previous months. But hopefully we all get better at diagnosing things that are happening and those diagnostic tools, so that we can make those correct recommendations based on really what is happening. So many times, we have the tendency to go after something and want to control it, perhaps before we have all that information. And it can be tough sometimes to diagnose things. But I think that's the best way, the most efficient way, the most effective way to control some of these things, or really get some effective treatments if really are needed at all. I've had some, I didn't include one palm tree picture that I just got the other day, just yesterday, that had some bagworms, and I'll maybe put those in next week. But really not a problem. They chewed a little bit on her Christmas palm fronds, but it wasn't something that really warranted anything. So the resident was much relieved. So that was a really good contact, because she was really worried that she was going to have to spray something, but typically not a problem, just a little bit of chewing. So those proper identifications are absolutely necessary. So all right, I will leave you all to it. I will definitely follow up with some of the fact sheets and any of the information from the slides here to follow up with you guys. But I sincerely appreciate your participation and hope to see you guys next month. Bring a friend.
Kate,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Nancy, there you are.
I couldn't get my chat to work.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So anyway, for maybe another time, if
Yeah.
you could talk about for what kind of fertilizers to use for some of the common Florida plants.
That's a great topic, Nancy. And I was like straddling that, thinking, should I talk about fertilizer yet? Because we're really coming into
right
when, yes. And so I can, definitely in a nutshell, I can tell you, but I will definitely include a lot more of that, I think, in next month's webinar. And
okay.
I'm happy to send you some follow-up things, but there are, in a nutshell, what I would recommend is really a slow release nitrogen fertilizer. One that I do, not one, but a type of fertilizer that I can recommend for really most of our landscape ornamentals, even turf grass, is a high quality palm fertilizer. And so 8012 is a fertilizer ratio that is really good. This is one that has been worked on through University of Florida, that is almost like the Goldilocks rate. Everybody's happy. The turf is happy. The palms are happy. The Thai plants are happy. Whatever else you've got is because too often we're using these really high nitrogen fertilizers. So that NPK ratio is like 20, 10, 10. That's a lot of nitrogen. And what can happen is palms are finicky. And if there is too much nitrogen being put out in our soils, it can tend to tie up other nutrients chemically in the soil. And they might be there, but they're not available. And so tying up those nutrients can start to send other things into nutrient deficiency tailspins. And so the lower nitrogen, and the way it's formulated, that slow release nitrogen, is much healthier, not only for our landscapes, but for our water quality. Because oftentimes we're using these quick release fertilizers that, if they are not used up right then, they completely leach out. And that's where we really get into some water quality issues. They're not being used by the plants. They end up in the storm drain, or those nutrients end up in the storm drain. And we've got all these problems, with the lagoon. And it's, that's a non-point source pollution. And it's just one of the things that happens with water quality. But in a nutshell, I would recommend a slow release nitrogen formulation. And if possible, a higher quality. And there are some, and I can send you some where you can get that. It's not that it's not that we recommend certain nurseries or fertilizer producers. It's just, it's a formula that has been worked on through research with UF. There are many other palm fertilizers. There's a fact sheet that's actually called "Not All Palm Fertilizers Are Created Equal," and they're not. And so it gets into a little bit of the chemistry of how things are formulated, but there's a good way to tell, really, and they've kind of made it pretty, I don't want to say easy, but a little more clear for folks to really learn, okay, what if I am going to fertilize, because many things that are mature and established in our landscape, they might not need fertilizer, to be honest. I mean, that is something we have to consider, is that some of these, crotons, the Schefflera, unless they really are showing you that they have some kind of deficiency, oftentimes they do not, once they're established, they really don't need supplemental fertilizer. They are getting what they need. But if you are in the scenario that, maybe this is a newly established landscape, or you've got some things that are showing, maybe you haven't fertilized in a couple years, or you have some palms that it's been a couple years and they're showing some deficiencies, it might warrant, okay, we need to, open the wallet and get some high quality fertilizer. But really, oftentimes what we run into is that if it's the right plant in the right place and it's doing successfully well, we really need to look at the plant more. Does it need fertilizer first? And then let's look at those high quality fertilizers. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Nancy, because I am going to, that's my plan for next month, is to kind of look at that a little bit further, but I'm more than happy to send you some things, and we can chat too. If you say, hey, is this a good one? You can send me, something you've looked at, or even send me some things like, hey, would you fertilize this? Does it look like it needs fertilization? Or like I said, maybe it's been a couple years.
Well, I have a bird of paradise.
Okay.
And I have moved it twice.
Okay.
And it looks healthy.
Okay.
But it's been in this spot for roughly 3 years.
Okay.
But it's never bloomed. It has grown.
Okay.
It has grown and it looks healthy, but it's not flowered.
And Nancy, I don't have a fact sheet in front of me, but personally, mine did the same thing. It took it was a long time. I want to say it was just recently that we started to get bloom, and now it blooms all the time. Like now I get like, oh my gosh, but it was a good 7 or 8 years before.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I don't, and I'm going to preface this by saying, like, I'm not sure if that is a typical growth habit of, it might be like, almost like, fruit trees. They need several years to really start bearing fruit. And what that false bird of paradise, or the bird of paradise, is doing is really, it's not fruit technically, but it's a flower. And sometimes it might just be that is its actual growth habit. And I only know that because personally it was almost 7 or 8 years, and we let it just be because it was growing fine, no big deal.
Looks great.
Yeah. But it could be, I did have, ours is kind of in the same area as some Christmas palms that I haven't fertilized in several years now. I did put some fertilizer, palm fertilizer down for them. They're in their own kind of ornamental bed. And that was a few years ago. That thing still never flowered. It still looked very healthy, but it did take a while. So I want to look in, like I should have looked when I first noticed it, but I want to look at those fact sheets and see if that may just be a typical growth pattern.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate all your info.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you said something about fertilizer, because I was really, last night I thought, gosh, we're getting close. If you are fertilizing this, we're coming into the time when it is the best time to do it. If it needs it. So I will definitely touch on that kind of more in depth, but I've made a little note here with you guys who are on the webinar. I'll just include some of those fact sheets so that you can read ahead of time, or if you have questions, but absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you,
great
Nancy.
session.
Awesome. I'm so glad you guys were here.
Okay.
Well, if that's it, I will let you all be, and I appreciate your lunchtime afternoon with me, and we're going to go head out to the fair and decorate. So thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.